Good afternoon. It's a pleasure to be with you on a very, very dreary day outside, and we can enjoy some splashes of color in this lecture for this afternoon. I'm Anne Leonard, Manton Curator of Prints, Drawings, and Photographs at the Clark. And in addition to, I'm very, very pleased to be welcoming you to this opening lecture for Hue and Cry, French printmaking and the debate, over colors. So it is really wonderful to be back in the Clark Auditorium for this lecture, although I'm also so thrilled to be able to welcome our virtual audience. And I can note that the recording and virtual dissemination of this lecture has been made possible by a grant from Mass Humanities, which provided funding through the National Endowment for the Humanities through the American Rescue Plan. So thank you. And in addition to thanking my colleagues all across the museum for their help in organizing this exhibition, I would like to extend my sincerest gratitude also on behalf of the Clark to Denise Littlefield-Sobel, who made the exhibition possible. We should never forget that the opportunity to see color prints exhibited is a rare gift. These extremely light-sensitive works must spend most of their life off view and storage to prevent their colors from fading. To see such a large number displayed together, 102 in this exhibition to be exact, is truly exceptional. All are from the Clark Art Institute's permanent collection. Fully half of them were acquired in 1962 from the collection of Dr. Herbert Michel of Chicago. Although I have been able to turn up precious little information about Dr. Michel in Institute records or from other sources, I do know that he had a supreme eye for quality and that he amassed an absolutely extraordinary trove of French 19th century color prints. Another tremendous piece of this exhibition, works by Mary Cassatt, Philibert Louis de Bucourt, Henri de Toulouse-Lautrec, and Jules Chere, came directly from Sterling and Francine Clark as part of their founding gift to the Institute in 1955. But you can see already from the enthusiastic tone of my commentary that I'm proceeding from an unstated assumption, which I'm now going to state. Namely, that color prints are works to be especially admired and enjoyed. It may be hard to understand that this was not always the view taken of color prints. Quite the contrary. These alluring and seemingly innocuous works were met with a disapproving or dismissive attitude for a surprisingly long time. And they sparked heated debate, raising fundamental questions about the nature and value of prints, whether they were original works in their own right, or simply vehicles for reproducing other works of art, most often paintings. But I'm getting a little ahead of my story. So first, let's consider the strong and deeply embedded associations that attach to colors themselves. Here are the different paint samples we tried for the wall colors in the exhibition. So take a look at the pink, the first one on the left. It's so feminine, right? It could be the rouge on Madame de Pompadour's cheek. Oh, there she is. And what about that yellow in the middle? Splashy, maybe even garish, you're thinking. Did you know there's a yellow rose called Toulouse-Lautrec? We don't need to be told why colors have these connotations for us. They just do. These pink and yellow colors, plus 3 slightly more neutral ones, each represent different sections of Hue and Cry. I wanted some of the wall colors to be on the bold side. For an exhibition like this, the colors need to catch your attention and provoke a reaction. Because that is the premise of the show, color, at least in prints, could be controversial. Colors in general carry visceral associations, as we've just seen, but printed color represents a special case. Painting, despite notable exceptions like the ink painting prevalent in East Asian art traditions and the modernist monochrome experiments of Casimir Malevich, Ad Reinhardt, and many others, is generally understood as an art of applying colors to a surface. Nothing shocking there. Prints, however, particularly in the European tradition, have most often been considered an art of black and white. The first woodcuts were understood as guides for the manuscript illuminator, with white space left open for hand-applied color. Later on, the best artists were praised for their ability to produce color effects in black and white prints. According to Erasmus, for example, Albrecht Dürer's designs did not require the assistance of color. What cannot Dürer express in monochromes, that is, by black lines only? And is it not more wonderful to accomplish, without the blandishment of colors, what Apelles, the legendary ancient Greek painter, accomplished with their aid? For centuries afterward, black and white prints were considered normative, while the use of color was viewed as out of place, inappropriate, a breach of decorum, in bad taste, take your pick, and it was expressly prohibited at the Paris Salon for almost the entire 19th century, until 1899. So color prints in France were an outlier category, a contested category. You might think that the history of color in French prints unfolds as a smooth series of technological advances, each one attaining an ever more accurate rendering of color. Yet that is not the story I aim to tell in this exhibition and lecture. The barriers to color printmaking were far more than technological. And this history, in France anyway, is structured nothing like a continuous linear narrative, but instead more like two discrete episodes with a 100-year gap between them. There was a burst of innovation in the late 18th century, then another so-called color revolution in the 1890s. Now, Erasmus might have been glad to know that until the 18th century, the only available technology for printing color was chiaroscuro woodcut, which means in woodblock printing, the addition of one or more tone blocks to a so-called key block used for contour lines. Practiced in Europe, starting in the 16th century, chiaroscuro woodcut was prized not so much for the variety of colors it supplied, but more for its capacity to evoke volume, shading, and three-dimensional form. Prints were thus posing a rivalry with sculpture more than with painting. As you can see in the magnificent Diogenes made in the late 1520s by Ugo da Carpi after design by Parmigianino, chiaroscuro woodcut did not seek color realism. Not only was printed color in this era not able to render multiple colors realistically, but the process was complicated and time-consuming. It required multiple blocks, multiple passes through the press, and a considerable time factor to allow drying between the application of each ink color. Printing color was also costly. Not much has changed there. Anyone who owns a color printer knows that even today, printing in color is more expensive than black and white. So for that reason, printing in color is always a choice. Whether or not to use color amounts to a value-laden decision, I would submit. And as proof that this is still true, I'm going to take the example of glossy magazines and show you some ads from a recent tea magazine published by the New York Times. Here's a page spread from an Yves Saint Laurent ad. The left side of the spread in black and white, with the block letters of the brand overlaying the abstract natural motif, asserts a kind of solid authority. Yet it's hard to imagine the right side of the spread without color. That image plays up the varied hues and textures of the model's clothing and jewelry, aspects which would be entirely lost in grayscale. And how about this pair, a black and white double-page spread for Hermès watches? It's not that a luxury brand like Hermès can't afford a color ad, but rather there is value to be had in the sparer, serious, timeless, dare I say, connotations of black and white. And a few pages later, we find Lady Gaga advertising Dom Perignon champagne. Think pink. As the associations with fun, frivolity, and excess pile up, I can hardly resist pairing her with Madame de Pompadour. And finally, let me offer you a pair of images showing Misty Copeland, principal dancer of the American Ballet Theater, advertising two distinct LG electronics products, a refrigerator and a TV. Misty Copeland emerges from a burst of vibrant color in the ad for the television, where it's important, but who cares about color for a refrigerator? In that ad, all on the left, she seems to float above clouds in an otherworldly monochrome space. It should not escape our notice that the ballet star Misty Copeland is a woman of color. I wonder if that fact is even being underscored, though subtly so, in this pair of ads. This brings us to the starting point of the exhibition, and a reminder that rendering different skin tones was quite difficult in the early days of color printing. Hand coloring was needed to do so in this portrait of Mirabeau, a key figure in the French Revolution. You can see that the impression on the left has been printed in a single color of ink, while the one on the right has been touched up by hand to give more realism and liveliness to the face. By the time of this portrait of Madame du Barry, color intaglio printing had come far enough that we can clearly make out the rouged cheeks of Louis XV's final mistress while she is being served coffee or chocolate by her young page, Zamore. Zamore was born in the Mughal Empire, captured by enslavers, and sold to Louis XV. Although it is unclear what legal status he had when he joined the retinue of Madame du Barry in France, this early instance of intaglio color printing nevertheless makes explicit the latent racial hierarchies that structured life in Ancien Regime France and well afterward. The portrait is dated 1771 and does rely on some hand coloring atop the printed color. Nevertheless, it points to the spectacular advances being made in color intaglio printmaking right around this time. Now, earlier in the 18th century, the techniques of chiaroscuro woodcut and etching had begun to be used in combination to reproduce wash drawings, as in the landmark print publication known as the Recoil Crozat. It was named for Pierre Crozat, who was the king's treasurer, one of the wealthiest financiers in France, and also a major collector of art. In the image on the left, dated 1729, you can see how the etched lines, printed in black ink, help give sense and shape to the flat areas of woodblock printed color. By the early 1760s, the first experiments in the new tonal medium of aquatint provided the impetus for a second edition of the Recoil Crozat. In the image on the right, aquatint, which was executed on copperplate and thus compatible with etching, took the place of the more laborious multiple block woodcut. And from there, the possibilities for printed color leapt forward quickly with superb innovations in intaglio methods over the 1770s and 1780s. You can see that jump in just 8 years. Now, chiaroscuro woodcut worked well for blocks of color, but was incapable of rendering the finer detail needed for scientific illustration. So the potential to create accurate and identical color images was of extraordinary value in the printing of anatomical atlases, botanicals, and a whole range of other scientific publications, such as this vivid green and ochre print of a wild celery root. It's part of the publication called The Collection of Usual, Curious, and Foreign Plants, printed in 1767 by Royal Commission. It was widely acknowledged that chiaroscuro woodcut had serious limitations when it came to reproducing paintings. No one was more keenly aware of this than J.C. Leblanc, a native of Frankfurt, who brought his newly invented color printing method to France in 1738. As he wrote, "With chiaroscuro woodcut comes a dryness that makes you think at first glance that it would have been better to stick with lines. No progressive tone, no lightness, everything is harsh. But with my technique, the print bears comparison with painting. It approaches nature itself. And if the work has been executed with all the refinements of which art is capable, very careful examination is required to determine that it is not the work of the paintbrush." In his treatise called Colorito, Leblanc argued that all visible objects could be represented with a combination of just three colors, yellow, red, and blue, from which comes the CMYK system still in use today. He followed an ideal of faultless, even deceptive imitation. Tellingly, he called his reproductions tableaux imprimés, or printed paintings. So even as the technology leapt forward, it did not by any means ensure that color prints made with these methods would enjoy fine art status. They were valued exclusively for their resemblance to paintings. The challenge for artists all the way along was to resist color printings getting co-opted into these reproductive uses and to assert a value for prints that was independent of mere imitation. But you can see in these sophisticated works also the taste for semi-naughty and licentious imagery. The patrons and collectors of these prints were mostly aristocrats or others closely connected with the royal court, those who were soon to lose their heads in the revolution. And once they did, production ceased abruptly. Thereafter, the medium was fatally tainted by its association with Ancien Regime decadence. You can see here the contrast between two prints by the same artist, but note the difference in date. 1787, pre-revolution, Dubuquour's Climb or Morning Farewell shows this richly realized, pictorial, fully colored effect. In contrast to what came later, the sort of comical Dance Mania print from 1809, required a different technique of applying color. Instead of the multi-plate method, each color being applied to a separate copper plate and being printed separate passes through the press, now all colors were applied to a single plate by a method called à la poupée. And you see, even in reproduction here on the screen, the difference in layering and the sort of the lack of richness in the later print. After this point, there is a long period of only hand coloring for virtually, well, for the majority of the 19th century. The most you have for color in prints is something like this, popular prints known as épinal prints, colored with bold primaries, but all applied by hand and often covering popular subjects. Here happens to be the railway connecting Saint-Germain to Paris, a new innovation in 1838, and also some popular devotional imagery, but nothing that we would consider printed color until the 1870s. And these two prints by Félix Bachmann and Edouard Manet are dated 1873, 1874, respectively. They're considered the two inaugural prints of the color revolution, that is, the return to color in late 19th century French printmaking. At the Zoological Gardens is a fully realized painterly print, whereas Manet's Punch, the character from the Commedia dell'arte, bursts onto the page, leaving a large part of the paper blank. Japanese prints had a huge role to play in making color permissible again. In 1890, Mary Cassatt had the opportunity to visit a major exhibition of Japanese ukiyo-e prints held at the École des Beaux-Arts in Paris. Blown away by what she saw, she wrote immediately to her friend, Berthe Morisot, saying, "You must see the Japanese. Come as soon as you can. You couldn't dream of anything more beautiful. I don't think of anything else but color on copper." And Cassatt proceeded to make a set of 10 color aquatints on copper plate. They're very rare now, and we're fortunate to be able to show this one in the exhibition from our permanent collection. She pulled early states herself from the press in her Paris apartment studio and brought in a professional printer for the final color proofs, which she oversaw. Camille Pissarro is another artist who ventured into color. His experiments bear notations at the bottom referring to the specific pigments he wanted for each area of the composition. You can see his reliance on the three primary hues, and also you might note the use of registration marks. Those are the dots or X's in the margins to ensure correct alignment of the individual color plates. Not all printmakers, though, even the most experimental, went into color. Edgar Degas, for example, who collaborated with Cassatt and Pissarro on print projects, left behind no examples of this kind. But a close friend of Degas, Pierre-Georges Janniot, made this print entrance to the Bois de Boulogne, which is a fashionable park just outside Paris. Note the large areas of white space. So here the artist is going out of his way not to be imitative of painting, but instead to preserve the raw qualities of the paper, instead of keeping the print very print-like. But in the end, color intaglio proved economically unfeasible. The number of prints that could be editioned was too low and the cost of production too high. The most consequential wave of experimentation in color printmaking occurred in the medium of lithography. Invented only in 1798, lithography had long been associated with commercial printing, advertising, journalism, and other ephemera. Because of its low cost of production, cheap paper, and massive print runs, it lacked fine art status. Posters, like those adorning the Morris column in the painting on the right, advertised popular forms of entertainment and would be the key to this transformation in perceptions of lithography in the 1890s. Jules Chere, the so-called king of the poster, broke down perceived boundaries between bourgeois and popular art with his sophisticated yet mass culture productions. His posters were called a public free salon of the street. He helped legitimize the poster in part because he had credibility as both artist and technician. From 1866, he headed his own printing company, and by 1889, he had designed over 1,000 posters, advertising everything from music halls and nightclubs to cough drops, as on the right here. He forged an exuberant modern style, and his vibrant, carefree women make you almost long for a head cold if it could make you look as chic and fashionable as that woman on the right. But as modern as they were, Chere's posters looked back to the Rococo style of the early 18th century. These lithographs, printed in red in the middle part of the screen, imitate red chalk drawings by Antoine Watteau and other French artists of that period. Chere added in the other two primaries, blue and yellow, and updated the look into something saucy, bold, and thoroughly of the moment. Toulouse-Lautrec was nowhere near as prolific as Chere, but is much better known today. He made his name overnight with this giant-sized poster in 1891. And I'm including this installation view on the right from an exhibition that was at the Museum of Modern Art in New York last winter. Just to give you the scale, it truly is wall-sized. The poster advertised the Moulin Rouge nightclub, where the dancer known as La Goulou performed her famous can-can. The art critic André Millerio said of Toulouse-Lautrec's Moulin Rouge, "This is no longer just a poster, and it is not yet quite a print. a work of a hybrid pungency deriving from the two, or rather, it is the modern color print. Malario had shrewdly identified the commonalities between posters and original art prints based on their shared formal characteristics. A simplified and bright palette, the strategic use of the white of the paper, and bold flat lines and areas of unmixed color. By reducing the scale of posters that had won over Parisians, they could be translated into prints at collectible size, and this became an entirely new category for fine art collectors that in turn exerted an influence on visual styles. But at about this point, the distinction between the fine art color print and the so-called chromolithograph became all important, for chromolithography had become big business. It used the same technologies as color lithography, but it had a very different resonance in terms of its popular perception. This is a print after Winslow Homer by Louis Prang. Louis Prang, based in Boston, ran a massive art reproduction enterprise. He purchased vast quantities of contemporary American art, which meant that he could avoid paying royalties to the original artist and copyright the resulting chromo himself. Sometimes 20 or more lithographic stones were used to render the full chromatic subtlety of a painting. Fine art printmakers were understandably adamant about distinguishing their original works from reproductive chromolithographs. Yet the processes involved in color lithography were so complex that a single artist could not execute the work from start to finish. This meant that the color printer was privy to something like a secret knowledge surpassing that of the artist. These experts in color analysis were said to know better than Turner himself, for example, how many colors Turner used in a painting and exactly in what combination. In the most sophisticated color printing, it was as if the artist had ceded his palette to the print technician. Auri Riviere started with color woodblock printing using the traditional Japanese process, which he learned himself. And he carved as many as 10 different woodblocks for a single design. But in midway through an ambitious series he had begun of Breton landscapes, the method proved too laborious and time-consuming, so he turned to the more forgiving medium of color lithography, as you see here, although he retains something of a woodblock aesthetic. Pierre Bonnard embraced color lithography from the beginning, but limited his palette to just a few colors, producing extremely inventive designs of great childlike charm within a strict economy of means. And so Signac in the Time of Harmony, gorgeous print that again works those three primary colors, but blends them in extremely sophisticated ways. And yet, amid all this production, the loss of control over methods and materials was a cause for anxiety among artists and critics alike. Artists dealt with this problem by working closely with trusted printers. Redon described the relationship as being like a marriage, for better or worse. Paul Signac worked side by side with Auguste Claux, a leading printer and technical advisor to artists. So probably difficult to see, but precious evidence of their collaboration survives. Here, an example by Paul Signac, his boats from 1897 to 98. Besides the final version in the upper right, which is printed in three colors, upper left, pardon me, there exists a printing from the pink and yellow stones only, that's at lower left, plus an annotated proof impression with Signac's own penciled instructions to Claux. And whenever I see this image, I always think, I don't know if OCD was an official diagnosis at the time, but I do think that this print shows us just how exacting Signac was and his demands from his printer. And these exquisitely produced prints still had no official sanction, in contrast to the late 18th century, when color prints could be shown at the salon and were even state-supported. In this polarized rhetorical climate around color lithography, many advocates of color prints went out of their way to trumpet these works' resemblance to popular imagery, notably Émile Bernard, who imitated the rough, crude stenciling and garish colors of Epinal prints in a hand-colored version. So he printed the lithograph on the right only in black ink, and then had assistants fill in the colors. And so he was sort of perversely going against the grain of the extreme sophistication of color lithography that we saw with Signac and Riviere. All the same, many vanguard artists managed to do their most creative work in color lithography. The last gallery of our exhibition, which I know you will enjoy seeing in the Lower Clark Center, is dedicated to 4 single artist portfolios published by Alfred Fulau right around 1898 and 99. And he commissioned 4 of the artists of the Nabi group who were closely knit and who were committed to art more as a decorative matter of arranging forms, shapes, and colors more than as a realist approach to representation. All 4 of these made portfolios of 12 prints each, plus a cover. At least they were all supposed to, but one of them, Russel, stopped at 7. He produced the 5 others in proof states, but they were never editions. So we have on view across the way all 4 portfolios: Pierre Bonnard, Maurice Denis, Pierre Russel, and Edgar Degas. These were they are rare to find intact these days because they were often separated and sold individually. And the Clark is so fortunate to have 4 complete intact portfolios, which, as I say, are shown in their entirety. These portfolios were actually a financial failure. Many of them went unsold, and yet Volard's visionary project affirmed the legitimacy of the color lithograph as a vanguard art form. I'll show you some more details from each of the portfolios. These are by Russel, Pierre Bonnard. These remarkable plunging perspectives, night scenes, verging toward abstraction, and some of the uses of color. Maurice Denis, 12 prints made as an ode to his wife, greatly admired, and he even includes inscriptions from poetry he had written during their courtship, very much inspired by symbolist poetry. It's a very tender, extremely subtle suite of prints. And finally, Edgar Degas. So again, Volard's project and the commitment to color lithography liberated artists to produce some of their most adventurous and audacious work in any medium. In that sense, these 4 Nabi portfolios embody the claim of André Mallerio in his important 1898 essay called Original Color Lithography, namely that any medium the artist chooses to express himself is, for that reason, legitimate. And then that era closed, and that is where the exhibition ends. So I will invite your questions at this time. Thank you very much for your attention.
I do have a question.
Yes.
Has silkscreen printing been used in fine art printing?
Yes, if you consider Andy Warhol a fine artist. Yes, but it's post my story. The exhibition ends right around 1900. So that there's a lot of continuing innovation in color printmaking, also informed by photographic techniques, photomechanical techniques, silk screen. So it's a very complex story that continues into the 20th century, but not in this exhibition.
I'm surprised that lithography came before silkscreen printing.
Well, yes, I mean, there's some of the examples you saw on the screen that were stencil or sometimes called pochoir is sort of related, but yes, silkscreen does not come into wide use by artists before the 20th century.
Thank you.
Thank you. Oh, yes. It's just so you have something to look at. There are the questions.
Anne, thank you so much. This is just a wonderful introduction to this very interesting exhibition. And I just wondered whether the condition of any of the pieces that you've chosen for the show are such that you will need to remove some of them and replace them with something else.
Yeah, that's a great question about the conservation and preservation of color. It is a balancing act in a museum, right? Our commitment, our obligation is to preserve works of art for future generations. And yet it does nobody any good if they sit in boxes for their entire life. And it's important that people see these works from time to time. So there are standard practices and rules that we follow as part of best practices in museums about the length of time that they can be shown. So color prints, they will be on view here for about 12 weeks. This show doesn't travel, so there won't be any other venues. And then, it sounds sad to say, but they probably will go back into their boxes for another 5 to 10 years. Now, the beauty of a place like the Clark with a glorious study room is that people can make appointments and see them as they want at other times. But to have them displayed all together in this way, yes, I would say it's sort of a once in a decade opportunity.
Is there a catalog of the exhibit?
There is not a catalog, no. Sad to say. There's a question in the back.
Well, thank you for opening our eyes in many ways. And I'm wondering, you talked a lot about, because of the printmaking, there was a new way to look at color and color theory. Did that influence the painters? Many of these were also painters. Did it influence the painting the other way?
Yes, it's a wonderful point you're making, and it's absolutely true. There's remarks. I didn't quote them in the lecture, but there are remarks by artists of the time. I think Vuillard is one example where he's experimenting with color combinations in print alongside a printer, and then comments on the fact that this is guiding him toward new thoughts about combining color in paint. So it is a process that is reciprocal, I think, absolutely so. It's just that the process is so different. When we think about mixing colors on a palette for painting, that is really a material combination, right? The pigments, the substance of the paint mixes together to form a combination. And in printmaking, it's always the idea of transparent layers of printed color, so that when you see them, you're actually seeing an optical combination. The colors themselves have been kept unmixed when they before application, but then as your eye perceives them, they mix into the color, into the full range of colors. So it's just that intuitively, it's not a direct one-to-one relationship. But yes, I think that it's attested to in the writings of some artists that they did find new directions for their painting and printmaking, which I think is an underappreciated aspect of these portfolios. I'm thinking particularly of the Nabi portfolios I showed at the end, and part of their importance. Yeah, thanks for that question.
Thank you for the lecture. And so you did make the point that the French Revolution had a significant impact on the development of this. What was going on in the rest of the world with respect to color printing?
Yeah, I mean, this is a vast topic. So I have, in a sense, the luxury of focusing just on France, where there's a particular history that unfolds in a certain way. But, you know, since you've gone there, I will say that for the rest of, even in the rest of Europe, that it does unfold differently. In Britain, for example, has a very different political history over the 19th century. There are instances of color prints earlier than this, Baxter prints. I mean, there are other techniques, inventions, and the break on innovation doesn't apply in the way that it did in France. But this is a very particular context. So it's true that to talk about controversy and debate over color, that's not something that can be generalized to a sort of European or wider context. It's very particular to France, but it is fascinating, particularly since the art establishment has so much to do with enforcing those prohibitions on color and print. Yeah, thanks. I don't see any other questions in the audience, so thank you again for being such an attentive audience, and enjoy the exhibition.